Sam Smyers here. Today I'll talk about how to use the Valhalla vintage verb. This is one of my favorite reverb plugins. I use it on just about every single one of my mixes, and I wanted to just go through the plugin and all of the knobs in different settings so that you know how to use it as well. I have another video on how to use the Valhalla vintage verb when you are mixing reverb on vocals, so I will put a link to watch that video in the video description below. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Before we get into the video, if you like videos like this, please consider subscribing and liking this video because that will help you stay updated with future videos just like this. So I am going to play you a synth sound. This is just a Juno brass sound. It's a very dry sound, and I'm going to be using this as our example sound because I want a very dry sound so that we can really focus on how the reverb is sounding relative to this dry sound. So this is that brass sound. So when you open up the Valhalla vintage verb, you have it looking like this. The color is set at 1970s. There are three different colors. You have the 1970s, 1980s, and now. So for the 1970s, down here in this section, it says downsampled 10 kilohertz bandwidth, dark, noisier modulation. So it's going to be a bit of a grittier, darker sound. Then you have the 1980s that has no downsampling, dark, and noisier modulation. So there is no downsampling happening, which means that above that 10 kilohertz, that bandwidth is going to be there. And then you have the now, which has no downsampling. It's going to have a more bright and clean sound. So the now is going to be a very, very bright sounding reverb. Let's go ahead and listen to these different colors. I have the mix set at 100%, so we're going to be listening to 100% reverb. Let's go back down. So hopefully you heard a difference. As you could hear, the now was much brighter than the 1970s, and as we get to the 1970s, it gets darker. So I will leave the color at 1980s, and over here we have the different modes. So as you go through the different modes, it'll tell you the different settings. So concert hall, slow attack, low initial echo density, chorus modulation, dark tone. I could set it to something like a plate. And so plate says fast and diffuse attack, bright tone, fast build of echo density, chorus modulation. And you can go through these different modes and try them out. So let's listen to plate. Room. Dirty hall. I will leave it at concert hall. And then we have the pre-delay. So pre-delay is going to set the amount of delay before the onset of the reverb. So if I play the note and I will change the mix to, let's say, 30%. If I play my note, I will have the original sound and the reverb hit at the exact same time because we have the pre-delay set at 0. Whereas if I set it to 500 milliseconds, you'll hear the reverb delayed. So there you can hear a pretty big delay between the initial sound and the onset of the reverb sound. And so what you can do is you can set this pre-delay according to your ear. You can add some milliseconds in between your initial sound and the reverb to add some separation between your initial sound and the reverb. Next, of course, you have the mix knob. Then you have the decay, and let me just go ahead and set the decay at 2 seconds as we go through the rest of the settings of this plugin. This section here is called damping. You have two different sections. You have the high frequencies and then the bass frequencies. So basically damping for the high frequencies is going to add a high shelf, and the high frequency knob here is going to set the frequency at which that high shelf is hitting. So you can set it all the way down to as low as 100 hertz to 20 1000 hertz. So you can adjust this however you want. And basically a high shelf is going to look like this. If we look at just a Pro Q3, this is what a high shelf looks like. So essentially what you're doing is you're just changing the amount of dampening happening to the reverb. And so if you set your high shelf knob here at 0 dB, then you're essentially taking the high shelf off. So the high shelf will just look like that. So there is no high shelf. So this is going to determine the slope of that high shelf. So we can just leave it at negative 24 dB. Let me play the sound. And let me set the mix to 100%. Take the high shelf off. Put at negative 24 again. So there you should hear some of the higher frequencies being dampened. Next we have the bass frequency knob and then the bass multiple. So the bass multiple scales the reverb decay time for bass frequencies relative to the decay parameter. So the bass multiple is set at 1.5 times. So 1.5 times the decay is going to be 3 seconds. So that means that the bass frequencies are going to decay at 3 seconds, whereas the higher frequencies will decay at 2 seconds. So the crossover for which we are determining where those bass frequencies are going to decay at 3 seconds is set at 700 hertz, and you can change this knob to determine where that crossover is going to happen. So let's go ahead and listen to how this bass multiple works. That is it set at 1.5. Let me go ahead and set it at 4x. So of course this means that it's going to be 8 seconds. So now you hear those lower frequencies of the reverb ringing out for a much longer time. And so I just raised this bass frequency crossover knob, and now you're hearing some of the higher frequencies ring out for a longer time. So let me go ahead and set this back at 1.5, and then this bass frequency I will set back to 700 hertz. Next, we have the shape, and the shape you have the size knob, and so the size is going to set the size of the room that you are listening to the reverb in. So as you can set it to 0%, it's going to make the room smaller, and then size set to 100% is going to make the room larger. So let's go ahead and listen to those different settings. That is the size at 100%. And then that is the size at 0%. So as you can hear, when the size is at 0%, it sounds like the reverb is really close and in your face and kind of metallic-y sounding, and then it diffuses more as you set it to 100%. This attack knob controls the initial attack of the reverb decay. A larger attack percentage means a longer attack time. So let's go ahead and listen to the attack of our reverb. Let me set it at 0%. Now 100%. Back to 0%. As you can hear, when I set the attack to 0%, we hear that attack of the initial sound. When I switch it all the way to 100%, you almost don't even hear any of the attack from the original sound. It almost sounds like it swells up into the reverb. Next is the diffusion section. So the diffusion section has a early and a late knob. So what happens when you set the early and the late knob to 0% is that you are essentially getting no diffusion. So your reverb is going to sound almost like a delay. So let's go ahead and listen to that. So do you hear how it just sounds almost like a delayed note? And what is happening is that when you increase the diffusion, you're diffusing that delay sound to make it sound more like a diffused reverb. So as I increase this early diffusion knob, we hear more of that reverb sound in the very beginning of the decay, and then as it diffuses out into the late decay diffusion, you have it set at 0%, so then it's starting to sound like a delay. So let me increase the late now. Let me set the early to 0% and the late to 100%. So that sounds like there's some delay at the beginning and then it all of a sudden turns into a reverb. So I will set that back to 100% because we want the diffusion from the reverb. Next you have the modulation. So the modulation is going to be a chorused effect. As you can see where I have this concert hall, it says a chorus modulation. So this modulation section is going to affect how that chorus modulation is affecting the reverb. So let's go ahead and set the early diffusion to 0%, and I have the mix at 100%, and I'm going to adjust these knobs and we can listen to what they do. So now it just sounds like a chorus effect. If I change this mix to 30%, then it just sounds like we are adding a chorus to that original sound. If I lower the depth, then of course there won't be as much modulation happening. So let me lower this depth. And that's just changing the level of that chorus modulation. So finally, we have the EQ section. EQ section is pretty simple. You have the high cut and the low cut. Low cut, this goes all the way up to 1500 hertz, and the high cut goes all the way up to 20,000 hertz down to 100 hertz. So if you want your reverb to sound really bright, you can put it all the way up to 20,000 hertz, or you can dampen it by putting it down to something like 6,000 hertz. You can do that depending on how you want it to sound with the original sound. So let me go ahead and play around with the EQ settings. So there I took off the damping and I have no high cut happening. So now the reverb sounds really bright. Now it sounds a bit darker. Then I can take this low cut up. And now it just sounds like we are adding some top end reverb to the sound. So now of course there are presets, so you can go through some of these different presets and try them on your sounds. And then you can select one. So I could do 300 large hall, and then I could adjust this according to how I want it to fit with my original sound. So I can adjust the mix and I can adjust any of these settings now that I know what they do to the reverb. And this has a different GUI mode for when you set the color to now. You can select lightness or darkness, and that just changes the black and white settings. So that is how you use the Valhalla Vintage Verb. If you want to see how to use the Valhalla Vintage Verb when you are mixing some vocals, I have another video that shows the whole process and some different techniques of how to mix reverb onto vocals, and I'll put a link to that video in the video description below. So if you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and give it a like and subscribe to my channel, because that will help you stay updated with future videos just like this. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.